Welcome to MAHZEN. Before we begin tonight's terrifying journey, take a quick moment to look around your room. Make sure your doors are locked and your windows are tightly shut. If you love true, bone-chilling horror stories and want to support the channel, please hit that subscribe button right now and turn on all notifications. It really helps a new channel like MAHZEN grow, and you won't miss a single nightmare. Now, sit back, turn off the lights, and let's dive into our first story.
Dad had been a long-haul trucker since he was barely out of his teens. He grew up in a time where you either went to school or you worked. There was no in-between. The Great Depression had a way of deciding that for you. He quit school after the 9th grade, picked up whatever jobs he could, and eventually found himself behind the wheel of a big rig, crisscrossing the country. Most of what he saw out there he never spoke about, but there was one night, one scene that he carried with him for the rest of his life, and he told it to me only the once. It was in the 1950s, before he'd moved to New Mexico. He was driving through the dark, quiet miles when the glow of flashing lights appeared ahead. A police roadblock. He eased the truck to the shoulder, the air brakes hissing, and stepped down into the cool night air. Up ahead, a convertible sat sideways on the road, its front end crumpled up like paper. Dad walked towards the wreck. A man in the driver's seat was slumped forwards, his head hanging unnaturally, blood pooling underhead. Dead, no doubt about it. But the passenger was upright, a young woman, pale and motionless but not lifeless. She looked right at him, and their eyes met and she blinked. He froze. Dad walked on until he met another trucker standing near the wreck, smoking a cigarette under the flashing red and blue lights. When he asked what happened, the man told him the story. The convertible's driver had apparently fallen asleep and plowed straight into the back of a semi. Both of them had died instantly, the man said. "That can't be right," Dad said. "The woman's still moving. She looked at me and blinked." The man shook his head. "No, look again." The windshield went through her neck. Dad's stomach turned cold. He walked back to the convertible and the man was right. Jagged glass had opened her throat clean cut. By all rights she was gone. But she was still blinking and moving her eyes. That was the first and only time Dad told that story. My mum was a long-haul trucker, and this is one of those stories that made me realize how terrifying her job could be. She was driving through northern Arizona, late one day, when she saw what looked like leaves blowing across the road far up ahead. That confused her, because there really weren't many leafy trees out there, just a lot of pine and scrub. When she finally reached what she described as leaves, she realized they weren't leaves at all. They were tarantulas. Thousands of them, slowly migrating across the highway in a living carpet. There were so many that her truck actually started to slide on the crushed bodies. She had to slow down to not lose control. Shaken, she pulled into the first truck stop she could find. Her co-driver was asleep in the bunk, so she woke him up and told him he had to get out and fuel because she wasn't stepping outside after what she'd driven through. He was furious. It was technically his off-duty time, and he thought she was exaggerating or losing it. Then he went outside, walked around the rig, and saw the splattered tarantula guts and legs caked thin inside the wheel wells. After that, he stopped calling her crazy. Another time in the Midwest, she literally outran a tornado. She'd been watching the sky get darker by the minute and was about to pull over to take cover like you're supposed to. Then she saw another big rig pulled over onto the shoulder get picked up and tossed a couple of 100 yards like it was a toy truck in some kid's hand. That's when she decided to go for it. She stayed on the throttle and kept going. At some point, convinced she might not make it, she called me. She told me she thought she was going to die and wanted her last words to me to be "I love you." And I remember the way her voice sounded, steady enough to drive, but with this terrified edge I had never heard in her voice before. She finally got far enough ahead of the storm to pull off the freeway and into a Walmart parking lot. She ran inside and followed staff and customers down into a lower level where everyone was taking shelter together. When the tornado finally passed and they climbed back up, there was open daylight, where there should have been a roof. The Walmart around them was shredded and torn apart. She has many stories like this one. According to her, trucking is 90% boredom, endless highway static on the radio, the same rest stops over and over, and 10% absolutely insane moments, like nearly being picked up by a tornado, seeing crashes everywhere, and the like. My dad told me and my brothers this story when we were growing up, and it's never really left me, especially on long drives. He first told it after I asked if angels were real, when I was probably around 7 or 8 years old, and still trying to figure out what I believed. Back then, long before I was born, he drove trucks for a living, in the days before anyone seemed to care much about responsible limits or enforced brakes. He would fairly often accept runs that stretched his shift until he was driving 24, sometimes 30 hours or more, with nothing longer than a quick bathroom stop or fast food run to break things up. My dad has a very mathematical brain. He can turn something completely mundane into a logic puzzle, and that amuses him. When I was a kid riding around with him, he would casually ask how long it would take us to get home to the store if we were going 30 miles an hour but had to stop 5 minutes in the middle because, say, a family of kittens was crossing the road. On the road by himself, he made up similar little equations using his odometer, mileage markers, and the clock, testing his speed and attention by checking whether his numbers lined up with reality. But one night, after a particularly long day behind the wheel, he felt his eyes growing heavier despite every cheap trick in the book. Rolling the window down, putting on loud music, shifting in the seat, not much helped. It was raining, and he was on a narrow, windy mountain road with no shoulder to pull over on. Nowhere else that felt safe to stop with a loaded truck. So he started doing those logic games out loud, talking to himself and just keeping his mind awake and focused on something. And he remembered saying something like, "I just passed mile marker 46, so what time will it be when I reach 200 if I'm going 55 miles an hour?" Working through the numbers while the wipers squeaked. At some point he closed his eyes for what he thought was just a deep breath. His head did the slow nod and a sudden jerk that every sleepy driver knows, and that motion snapped him back with a sharp gasp. He opened his eyes and saw himself heading straight for mile marker 158, dead on, the post lined up perfectly in the center of his lane. Hitting it would have ripped the truck open and sent everything, rig, trailer, and driver, tumbling down a black, empty mountain ravine. He yanked the wheel just in time, hauling the trunk back onto the wet, curving road, with only seconds between that moment and a very different ending. To this day he swears he slept through 12 miles of twisting mountain highway at 60 miles an hour or more, with the truck somehow staying on the pavement the whole time. He tells it not like a hero or a confession, but something that he's terrified of. The story usually ends with his eyes getting wet and his voice getting softer, and he says, "I don't know if there are angels, but I know there's something bigger going on in the universe that our brains can really understand. If I hadn't have woken up when I did, you kids wouldn't be here today, and that feels pretty close to spiritual to me."
Thank you for listening to tonight's stories until the very end. If these real encounters gave you chills, please show your support by hitting that like button, subscribing to MAHZEN, and sharing this video with a friend who loves horror. Now, I want to hear from you. Which of these 3 stories terrified you the most? And if you were the security guard in the final story, would you have looked up at the rafters? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one of them. Stay safe out there and sleep with one eye open. Until next week.